Over the years, I made a few predictions on this channel. Not many, and I specifically call them predictions rather than prophecies because I don't claim to be making them under any kind of special divine inspiration. To reach my conclusions, all I'm really doing is I'm just looking at the Bible to gain an understanding of creation, reality, the world in which we live in, and especially an insight into human nature. I'm looking at what's happening politically in terms of current events in our world right now. And then I'm looking for similar moments in history and for repeating patterns. And I think, well, if my understanding of the Bible is true, and this is what's happening in the world politically right now, and there's a precedent for this in history, then this other thing should probably happen quite soon as well. It's like what Winston Churchill said. He said, the further back you can look, the further forward you're likely to see. So by looking at the Bible, by looking at what's going on in the world, by looking at history, we should be able to get some kind of idea of where we're going. And in this video, I want to talk about 3 predictions that I made over the years using this exact method. One of the first predictions that I can remember making on this channel was way back in 2012 when I made the Stay Free series. And I said there that in the future, the West, and therefore probably the wider world, was going to have to confront the threat of rising tyranny and authoritarianism. That was one of the main themes of the Stay Free series, that our freedoms were going to be eroded in the passing of time in the coming years. And therefore, if we wanted to stay free, we were probably going to have to confront that threat one way or the other in the years ahead. Now, to show the working behind that prediction and how I used that method to come to that conclusion, it began with a quote by Edmund Burke, who said, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters." Now, why does Burke say that we need a moral chain or a controlling power placed somewhere on our appetites? Well, this is where the Bible then gives us insight, because the Bible tells us that our appetites are by their very nature sinful. From cover to cover, the Bible tells us repeatedly that every human being is born with an inherently sinful nature, which gives us sinful appetites, which basically means we're all predisposed towards behaving selfishly. We're predisposed towards putting ourselves first. And it's out of that selfishness that we get lying, stealing, cheating, corruption, all these things that have plagued the world since time began. When you lie to someone, you're putting yourself first. When you steal from someone, you're putting yourself first. When you cheat on someone, you are putting yourself first. Selfishness is the essence of sin, and sin, unfortunately, is our very nature. Now, the Bible tells us that to live a righteous life, which is what we should be doing, we need to put Jesus first, others next, and ourselves last, humbly picking up our cross, giving up our own way, giving up our own desires, the Bible says, and sacrificing of ourselves in the service of God and for the good of others. That's a righteous life. That's to live selflessly. It's also a joyful life, J-O-Y. That's how you remember it. Joy. It gives you a joyous life. To live a sinful life, however, means to invert those priorities. It means putting yourself first, others next, and then God, you just forget about him and ignore him altogether. That's a sinful life, to live selfishly. And by the way, this is also what Satanism is. Satanism is just inverting righteousness so that instead of God being worshipped, you worship yourself. You kind of swap positions with God and you put yourself on the throne of your own life. The highest holy day in Satanism is your own birthday because it's a celebration of your own God, i.e. you. Now, the problem is that although this is our natural way of operating, this is our nature, unfortunately, but when everyone lives from this sinful nature and puts themselves first in this way, society begins to break down. Society can't function this way. The fabric begins to tear. Civilization cannot exist when everyone is acting in their own self-interest. First of all, on a foundational, horizontal, kind of relational level with each other, when people are lying, stealing, and cheating one another, it causes this atmosphere of fear, distrust, suspicion. It causes division amongst us. It creates a kind of dog-eat-dog kind of world, a survival of the fittest kind of world. But then on an institutional level, as we elect politicians and leaders from among us, as we do in a democracy, and put them into positions of power, sinful people who serve themselves will tend towards corruption. So one of the reasons why many African nations just can't seem to get up off their knees, no matter how much money's pumped into them, is because the leaders are self-serving and corrupt. They are putting themselves first, meaning they keep the money for themselves, or they give out little backhanders, or they award massive infrastructure contracts to friends and family at massively inflated prices to make them rich, and therefore trying to secure their own position, power, and authority going forward. They're not serving the people sacrificially as they should. They're merely serving themselves. They're kind of lording it over the people instead of putting themselves underneath the people and humbly serving them and sacrificing of themselves for them. They're sort of lording it over the people, putting themselves first. And what happens in these places is that all the leaders then end up living in mansions and flying around in helicopters and private jets and Mercedes with blacked out windows, while the infrastructure of the country collapses and the people remain poor. So when everyone's living from their own sinful nature on a relational level, there's a distrust and a suspicion and division, and the social fabric's tearing and there's division. As it affects society's institutions, though, corruption then begins to infect that area, and the structures and the apparatus that hold civilization together, that all begins to crumble as well. And also a distrust develops between the people and the politicians that are supposed to be serving them, but who instead are corrupt and are just lording over them. As Burke says then, for society to exist, there needs to be some kind of controlling power on these selfish appetites, on the sinful nature. And the power that has traditionally done that in the West, the power that has made us good internally, the power that has made us all selfless and that has allowed our society to function, that power has been Christianity. Up until a generation or two back, the majority of people in the West attended church every week. Their kids went to Sunday school every week. And so everyone was given biblical instruction weekly on how to live a righteous and selfless life. The Bible taught us to put God first, others next, and ourselves last. Jesus said, the most important command is you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. God, others, you. Jesus taught us about servant leadership when he kneeled to wash his disciples' feet and he said, do you understand what I was doing? You call me your teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Serve the people you lead humbly. Don't lord yourself over them. Don't put yourself above them. Instead, sacrifice yourself for those that you lead. Jesus said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man, that is Jesus himself, came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is saying that if you want to become a leader, you are to sacrifice yourself for the people just as he did. He sacrificed himself on the cross for his people. Humbly serve them. The people of the West imbibed this teaching. The leaders of the West imbibed this teaching. They followed Jesus' example. They lived selflessly. They lived sacrificially. And the Bible also promises that when you become a Christian, God puts his own spirit within you to help give you the power you need to overcome your sinful nature. The Bible says, let the Holy Spirit guide your lives. Then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. These two forces are constantly fighting each other. It then goes on to list what happens when we follow our sinful nature. And it says that if we do, there will be selfishness and division. That's what we saw earlier. That's what causes societal collapse. But then it says, but if you live by the Spirit and live righteously, there will be love. There will be joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That is why Western civilization prospered and became a nice place to be, because people were being made righteous internally by biblical instruction and by the power of the Holy Spirit. It was overriding our inherent sinful nature, and it was making us all live righteous and selfless lives. Now, the reason I made that prediction back in 2012 was because the West is now clearly rejecting Christianity. And as it does so, it rejects the power that made us righteous. It rejects that which made us selfless and sacrificial. And increasingly, that will mean that the sinful nature will start to come back to the fore, and it will start to guide people's lives. We will revert back to selfish appetites, which means narcissism and division and distrust and fear and corrupt leaders and people losing faith in the institutions and the apparatus of society. And as civilization collapses, it then gives a pretext for these corrupt leaders to just rise up increasingly in tyranny, to kind of lord it over the people even more. So the bottom line here is that Christianity is what made the West free, and Christianity is needed to keep the West free. The foundation of our freedom in the West is the moral goodness which was imparted to us by the Bible and by the Holy Spirit. Without Christianity, we cannot be free. I'm going to say this one more time because it's so important. Without Christianity, we cannot be free. As we reject Christianity, we reject the foundation of our freedom, and tyranny will therefore only increase. Now, I've got to say that when I made that prediction in 2012, though, I thought it would take much longer to get to where we currently are. The speed at which we've fallen into this has really kind of surprised me, if I'm honest. I thought this may happen decades down the line. Little did I think that just 8 years after making that prediction, we would have experienced the government response to COVID, for example. Western governments locking free citizens inside their homes. Effectively, every home became a jail cell in a prison planet, and we were only allowed out once or twice a day. Raiding and shutting down church services and businesses, tracking people's every move, reporting on them for going to the park or the beach or on a dog walk. The government encouraging people to snitch on their neighbours like it's East Germany. The government setting up a unit to monitor people who were criticising them online. Setting up a propaganda unit to fearmonger the people into compliance. Literally copying the communist playbook. That was a shock for me that all of that happened quite so quickly. Austria was on the verge of injecting the vaccine into people against their will. And the authoritarianism, of course, is just ramping up all the time. People are being arrested for tweets. A two-tier policing system is emerging in the UK where if you protest for things the government approves of, the police will just stand by and let you do it, or they'll even kneel in front of you. But if you protest against the government for things like freedom and freedom of speech, they'll still kneel, but they'll kneel on your neck. Ireland is currently trying to push through a hate speech bill, which is just unbelievable in its scope of powers. It's moving Ireland towards a place where criticism of the government will become illegal, and people can be arrested for just owning books and videos and memes. A similar thing was attempted in Scotland a few years ago, and it was kind of watered down. But in Ireland, they're quite open now about their attempts to restrict freedom of their citizens. I saw this woman just yesterday admitting that that's what it's all about.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good.
This is how all tyrannies begin. This is how it's always presented to the people at first. We're taking your freedoms away, but it's for your own good. It's for the good of the collective. It's cultural Marxism. It's basically communism. As C.S. Lewis said, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. How long till owning a Bible becomes illegal in Ireland? One of the first things that tyrants always do is ban the Bible because they know it's the foundation of freedom and a threat to their control. The UK government's been trying to push through a bill that criminalises free speech on the internet as well. We've seen the globalists becoming very open about trying to create a future of authoritarian government. So I can confidently say that this prediction has come true, is coming true, and unfortunately a lot faster than expected. A second prediction that I made, I think around the same time originally, but then I certainly remade it around 2016, I think it was, because I remember the first time I said it, it didn't really catch, it didn't make much of an impact, but then the second time it did, and I had lots of people talking to me about it. And the prediction was that in the future, we would likely see people trying to push for the acceptance of paedophilia. Now, at the time, that was quite an outlandish prediction to make, and I was wary about making it. I thought if you say something like this, it's going to sound a bit eccentric. People might think you've lost your mind here. Because at that time, if there was one thing that everyone in society still agreed was absolutely wrong, it was this. It was paedophilia. So it was difficult to see how attitudes would ever change. And yet, as I looked at the evidence and as I applied this model, it just always led to that conclusion. So that's why I decided to make it public. I sort of recalculated the numbers. I crunched the data. It just always ended up there. So I eventually made it public. Now, what was the thinking then behind this one? Well, when I looked at Greco-Roman times, I saw that paedophilia was quite common and accepted in that society 2,000 years ago, especially as the Roman Empire entered its last phase before moral collapse In that time, paedophilia was rife, and it was only as Christianity came into that polluted culture that the sexual ethics of the West was cleaned up and paedophilia was eventually ended. Christianity, again, was that power. So I thought, well, again, if Christianity is the power that made people good, as our culture then rejects that power, it's likely we will probably see the sexual ethics of our society beginning to regress, beginning to slide backwards into sin, back to where it was in Greco-Roman times. That's one of the results of following the sinful nature: sexual immorality, impurity, and lustful pleasures. Now, by 2016, we'd already seen the first signs of that sexual regression with the acceptance of homosexuality. That already existed. Gay marriage, I think, was approved in 2014. So I kind of viewed that as being the beginning of a slippery slope. And as I looked to head down that slope, I saw that eventually we'd reach a stage where people would try to push for paedophilia, and then maybe even bestiality beyond that, because that wasn't completely unknown in Greco-Roman times either. It wasn't as widespread, but it wasn't completely unknown either. Actually, let me say something completely wild here and just be completely honest. I think the slippery slope probably started with the radical feminism of the 1960s, because the message of radical feminism was that there's no difference between the sexes at all. Whatever a man can do, a woman can do just as well, and whatever a woman can do, a man can do just as well. There's no difference between the two. Now, that is a basic denial of reality. And once you made that basic denial, the next logical step is to say, well, if there's no difference between the sexes, and if there's nothing unique to masculinity and nothing unique to femininity, then what's wrong with two men together or two women together? And in terms of parenting, if there's nothing unique to feminine motherhood and nothing unique to masculine fatherhood, then why not two fathers or two mothers? It's just all the same thing. And so you've got homosexuality. And then the next stage in that sequence is to say, well, if masculinity and femininity are such meaningless terms, then a man can literally become a woman if he feels like it. He just has to put on a wig and a dress and some makeup, and vice versa. So then you get into transgenderism. And then once you've denied those basic realities, there's an inevitable next phase where you deny realities around age, and then again, maybe even around species. None of it matters. Love is love, right? That's the message. So one denial of basic reality inevitably leads to another, which then leads to another, and then leads to another, until eventually you get into complete sexual confusion and complete sexual mud. This is a continuum that I think very few people actually see. Even people I really respect and who are consistently on the right side of the culture war time after time, people like Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, Konstantin Kisin, they're all in favor of homosexuality. They'll all agree that facts matter more than feelings. Yet when it comes to homosexuality, the biological fact here is that men and women are made for one another and are different, and vice versa. There are unique aspects to masculinity. There are unique aspects to femininity that the other just isn't capable of. And once you confuse that, you end up confusing everything. It's a continuum. One denial of reality has led to the next, which has led to the next and the next. And yet you often get people like Murray and Peterson speaking up for homosexuality. I just don't get it. And they talk as though they'd like to go a little bit further up the slope, but not all the way back up the slope. But we have to come back to a biblical understanding of reality, which is that men and women are different, equal in value, but different in nature and in capabilities. And I say that with all due respect to Peterson and Murray and all those people, because I think they're very important voices and they're doing a great work. So I'm saying this in all humility, but we must address this blind spot. Now, when I made this prediction about paedophilia, again, I'm really shocked at how quickly this has happened. I expected this would be decades away, maybe not even in my lifetime, in fact. However, within just a couple of years of that video, there started to appear TED Talks trying to justify paedophilia and people trying to win sympathy for it and trying to promote it as a normal sexual orientation and trying to say people are just born that way and they can't help it, and trying to change the name to minor attracted persons, MAPs, so there's no stigma around it anymore. And then came a concerted effort to sexualize children in schools through books and through drag queen story times. The United Nations recently said sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent may be consensual, in fact, if not law. So they're trying to blur the lines. We see this now very openly, people saying things they would never have said just a few years ago. And so as crazy as it is, I think this prediction is also coming true. It's still not received wide support, you'd have to say, but you can definitely see some people trying to hammer away at this now, quite openly, trying to push for its acceptance. And a prediction that once seemed a little bit eccentric, a little bit weird, I certainly felt that way, I think the majority of people would now say it's kind of coming true. I can see people definitely trying to push for this very openly.
The community and the child, if the child so desires to have intercourse with an adult, and do I feel that some minors are more equipped to engage in sexual activity with adults than others? Yes.
Now that leads me on to the third and final prediction that I want to talk about in this video. It's one I've been making a bit more recently. I think I maybe first said it around the War on Truth in 2017. I know I definitely spoke about it in Trench. I spoke about it in a recent Answer season as well. I know I've just said this maybe 3 or 4 times now in recent years. And it's the prediction that we are probably heading towards some kind of world war and or some kind of massive economic collapse. Now, the thinking behind this one was basically that there are globalists right now who want to create a one world order, and the Bible confirms that this is going to happen at some point. So that's the overall trajectory that we're on. And as you look through history, every leap towards increasing cohesion has normally occurred on the back of a war or some kind of economic collapse. So my thinking was, in order for us to make another jump in that direction, that will probably happen at some point. Now, when I made that prediction, again, I was thinking this would be decades away. But in the same way that others have arrived a bit sooner than I expected, I have a very strong suspicion right now that this one could be a lot sooner than expected as well. I don't like to talk about timings because I really have no idea, but I'm just increasingly getting this sense that this prediction may not be too far off. In fact, I tweeted this recently. I said, I can't help but feel that there's a war up ahead. And then the next day, Peter Hitchens wrote an article titled, I fear we are now living in a pre-war age. So I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way. I've noticed quite a lot of people online talking in these terms. I don't know how much to say right now about my working, and I've been wrestling with this about how far to go in this video, how much to reveal of what I've been thinking recently, but I just think there's lots of warning signs flashing at the moment. Maybe I'll do another video actually where I'll talk about those warning signs, because there's maybe about 10 of them, I think, and this video is getting quite long anyway, so I should probably wrap it up, because here's the thing I want to end on. This is really what I want to land on. It's very strange, but even as I see this approaching, even as I see things getting darker around us, very strangely, I'm also getting the feeling that there's a lot to be hopeful for ahead as well, which might be a bit of a contradiction. That might appear to be a strange thing to say, but let me explain. T.S. Eliot once said, "The world is trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail, but we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time so that the faith may be preserved alive through the dark ages before us to renew and rebuild civilization and save the world from suicide." I don't know if it's just me, but it seems that as we see things getting darker, and as we may be approaching the collapse spoken about here by T.S. Eliot, it seems to me it's causing a lot of people to open back up towards Christianity. Many people, even atheists, are beginning to realize that it was Christianity that built the West. Christianity is the foundation of our civilization and freedom. We lost something when we turned away from God. I think there's a mourning right now for the collapse of Western civilization, and many people are beginning to make that connection that it was Christianity that gave us this place that we love, along with all of its traditions. And there's a realization that we started going wrong when we abandoned that faith and when we abandoned Jesus. I might be getting this wrong, but it seems to me there's a growing desire right now for people to rediscover Jesus. This is Douglas Murray talking about it quite recently.
The Christian world is as it is because of the legacy of Christianity. I mean, it's from Christianity that we get the idea of rights. Why do I say that? Because even the framers of the European Constitution pretty much knew this. Certainly the framers of the UN Declaration on Human Rights knew this. Certainly the founding fathers of the United States knew this. That the reason why all men are regarded as equal is because all of mankind is created equal by God. And that people may be different in their lives, and we're all different in our lives, and you may be a car mechanic or a king, but that we're all the same. We're all the same in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Creator. Nobody to that extent has the ability to be, is by nature better or worse than anyone else. It's the adventure of their lives to try to be better. But all of these ideas, like the dignity of the individual, these come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And without them, we would be, like China, or like the Islamic world, or like anywhere else. If we had a different tradition in our past, we would be in a different place now. But this was our tradition. This is our tradition. And anyone who thinks that what I've just described is as water is to fish is making a vast category error.
If I may make this observation, one of the things that has really struck me over the last decade, as there's been a lot of soul searching in the West amongst leading thinkers, is that even people of no belief, I'm plainly Christian, there are a lot of people who don't personally believe, have personally come to the view there's no God or they don't believe in the Christian God, but are able to see intellectually the unbelievable importance of Christianity to what Churchill, I think, as a non-believer, would have called the benefits of civilizational Christianity. And that if we're not careful, if we continue denying that, we'll just be left with nothing, no wellspring, nothing to cling to, just narrow materialism.
This idea that Western civilization is like a cut flower and you can look at it and enjoy it, but it's going to die.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that it isn't a cut flower? And the answer to that is, of course, we find the seeds that planted the flowers and we reseed the land. We replant the flowers, the trees and the bushes of our culture and of our civilization. And that's what we should do. That will be part of the task ahead. And that doesn't mean the dogmatic re-Christianization, although some people might like to go that route, but it does mean a recognition of the wellsprings. And, without that, nothing good can come. Without that, we will simply be a flower that withers and dies.
If we don't want our civilization to be like a cut flower that withers and dies, we need to reseed the land. And as Murray says, that will be the challenge for us in the days ahead. I differ from him when he says it doesn't need to mean the re-Christianization of society. I think it does. We need to reseed the land with the message of Jesus Christ. Nothing else is going to do it. And that puts me in mind of the parable of the sower, of course. We need to start scattering these seeds across the land. And the good news is, I think the soil for that seed is beginning to get a bit more fertile. And I get such a feeling of hope when I hear people talking like this, beginning to wake up to this. I've spent over 10 years now trying to get this message through, and it's just always felt like an uphill struggle, like I'm mostly talking into a void. And of course, there are many people who followed the Fuel Project all these years and supported the Fuel Project, and I just don't have the words to express my gratitude for that. But I've always felt that the message is not really reaching the wider culture. It's not really changing anything in a wider scale. So I just get so excited to see that there's a bit of a sea change occurring perhaps right now. There's a feeling of people beginning to wake up finally. People are beginning to vote a little bit differently now across the West. I'm very interested to see the voting results in nations across the next couple of years, because there's a feeling that people are finally beginning to wake up to the path that we've been on and just saying, what are we doing? What have we been doing? And so even as there may be some very dark days in front of us, and I think there will be, I think there is also so much reason to have hope. And I'm so excited for that. As we're approaching Christmas, we're soon going to be singing O Holy Night. And in that song, there's the lyric, a thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Fall on your knees. I think when we sing that this year, it's going to be a prayer that that's what we're going to see in the coming years. I certainly hope so.